afternoon, everyone. Professor Cullen holds a PhD in American Studies from Brown University, and he has taught at Harvard, Brown, and Sarah Lawrence College before settling down for 90 years at the Ethical Culture Fieldstone School in New York, where he served as a chair of the History Department as a member of the board of trustees. Since 2020, he has been a member of the faculty at the recently founded Greenwich Country Day School in Greenwich, Connecticut. And he's the author of over 20 books, including The American Dream, Short History of an Idea That Shaped a Nation, Rich and Tunnel Boys, Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, and the Metropolitan Sound of the American Century, and Born in the USA, Bruce Springsteen in American Life. That this is the one that we will be discussing today. So, my first question is, as it is explained throughout the chapter, Bruce Springsteen's biggest influence was probably Elvis Presley. What is more, he states, women, young girls, and many men screaming for what the cameras refused to show, for what their very timidity confirmed and promised another world. The one below your waist and above your heart, a world that had been previously and rigorously denied was being proved to exist. It was a world with all of us in it. In Springsteen's autobiography, Born to Run, Elvis Presley's first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show is described as the Big Bang. And the chapter precisely starts with the impacts that the King of Rock and Roll has had on the boss music. Nevertheless, it is stated at the end, Presley seemed to have been overcome by his own conception of the American dream, something that hasn't happened with Springsteen. In Dave Marsh, Bruce Springsteen to Hearts, the story, it is wondered how somebody who could have had so much could in the end lose so badly, and how dreams don't mean nothing unless you're strong enough to fight for them and make them come true. And you express this in a different way. Presley's American dream became his prison and ultimately his tomb. To what extent could we agree that the student, and I mean student, I refer as a student to Bruce Springsteen, has beaten the master, and the master will be Elvis Presley? So what are your thoughts on this, Mr. Cullen?
Well, I guess you'd say that the student has beaten the master just on the basis of survival alone, and I think that's probably what he would say, and there's a little bit of a modesty to that. I mean, the survival is nothing to be sneezed at, but it doesn't have the sort of Promethean originality that Presley did. You know, as you were reading that quote, I found my mind perhaps strangely thinking to Athenian Greece, and that Elvis Presley was like the Pericles of the American Empire. You know, the kind of embodiment of it at its most gleaming, beautiful apex, and the memory of that, has sort of, will transcend its moment. It certainly did for the Greeks, and I think it will. I think this will be what people remember about America after the American Empire is gone. But just as Pericles had to, the Peloponnesian War followed Greece's golden age. You know, the pitfalls of Elvis Presley's dream, followed in his wake. And I think that Bruce Springsteen understood that image, as beautiful as it was in multiple dimensions, was not the whole picture. And this is something I think he understood just at the level of managing his personal life, but I think he also understood it in terms of, embracing a sense of complexity and perhaps a sense of tragedy that Elvis Presley, could not really fully attain in his artistic vision. I don't know if that's the kind of thing, if I'm on the right track here. I invite anybody else to jump in, but that's my reaction to what you're saying.
Okay. Supposing that Springsteen has become a retelling of the American dream, an inheritor of Elvis, who would you consider the inheritor of Springsteen? If so, could you describe the kind of American dream this artist would represent? Because in your book, The American Dream, A Short History of the Idea That Shaped a Nation, up to 6 different types of American dream are identified. the,
Mhm.
the dream of a good life, the one illustrated in the Declaration of Independence, the one of upward mobility, the dream of equality, the dream of home ownership, and finally the dream of the coast. So, yeah, what is the reality of the 2024 American dream?
Well, if at the risk of pushing my luck here, I will say that the sort of characteristic gift of Athenian civilization was democracy, which of course was a much more complicated concept than it initially appeared, in Athens and afterward. And of course, for someone like Elvis Presley, he's this embodiment of the American dream. And as you say, I do think that the American dream, has taken different forms over the course of the last 400 years. It began primarily as a religious idea in the 17th century with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and it became a kind of secular transcendence in the 20th century with sort of the advent of Hollywood, which perhaps paradoxically confers a kind of earthly grace that parallels the sort of sacred grace that the Protestants of America were pursuing. In terms of who carries that forward, I mean, the important thing about the American dream is that it is at heart a democratic idea, and I think everybody sees themselves in the States as sort of having some sort of relationship to either they are somebody's child who represents the flowering of the dream, or they are someone's parent who represents the promise of the dream, or they have attained some measure of mobility that makes them exemplars of the dream. And of course, there's no American politician, whether justified or not, who won't in some form invoke it. I think that in the last presidential debates, Donald Trump suggested that his father only staked him a few $1 million, so like this empire that he created was legitimately his own. In the terms of the world of popular music, I would say that the person who most approximates Springsteen now is probably someone like Taylor Swift, and I mean that not just as a matter of commercial success. She's probably exceeded him on that level, but in terms of both of their sort of wholehearted embrace of this idea, she came from fairly comfortable circumstances, although there's no question that she has blazed an impressive sort of trail in her life. But I think that she embodies a verb I use advisedly here, a notion of catalyzing, realizing what one saw in one's mind's eye as a vision of success that she has gone on to attain.
Wow, I didn't expect the Taylor Swift answer, but
No,
it's
I'm
quite
surprised.
interesting.
Why is that surprising?
I don't know, like I've never thought like Taylor Swift as like the inheritor of Springsteen. But I know that she has been also influenced by his music. But yeah, it's a really interesting insight, to be honest.
Mhm.
So going back to what Springsteen said of Elvis, it was a world with all of us in it. Do you believe that this idea could also be applied to his own music? On his last album, Only the Strong Survive, the artist seems to embrace this musical diversity and multiculturalism. Another album that comes to my mind when it comes to this inclusivity is The Rising. Songs like Worlds Apart invite listeners to embrace other religions as well. So I don't know, what's your take on this?
Well, I think there is a vision of America that Springsteen clearly shares, that the essence, and I realize this is a paradox, but I think it's true. The essence of the United States is its diversity. E pluribus unum is the national motto, out of many one, and that I think was true from the very beginning. When you look at whether you're talking about sort of places like New York, which was a melting pot, a multilingual melting pot from the very moment it was founded by the Dutch, or whether you're talking about the legacy of Spanish America in on the West Coast, or whether you're talking about a place like New Orleans. And I think that Springsteen was very, very conscious of that, certainly in terms of his own background as someone who had primarily Italian and Irish heritage. and being born at a time when Italy was, Italians were, really second-class citizens, especially Southern Italians. And I speak as the grandson of a Neapolitan immigrant. So this was something I think he was very aware of as a child, and really sort of absorbed and tried to reflect. And he is someone who I think is very self-conscious about trying to trace and include various strains in American music. He is in that sense quite conservative, in terms of trying to preserve and extend American musical traditions. He's not an innovator, and I think that's really one of the differences between him and someone like Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was this sort of, I think I used the term before, but I'll use it again, this sort of Promethean figure who actually was himself a bit of a melting pot. I mean, he loves the Italian opera singer, Mario Lanza, and there's a sense of drama in some of Presley. In fact, he recorded, an English version of O Sole Mio, along with, the blues music that he grew up with, along with the church music he grew up with. And there was something just so fresh, so startlingly original about the sound that Presley made. And I do want to emphasize that, because sometimes Presley is dismissed as derivative, as merely a white boy mimicking African-American sounds. And I understand where that's coming from. And certainly there are ways in which Presley was an unfair beneficiary of his racial heritage, but I don't want to sell him short in terms of what he authentically achieved, as a musician. And in that regard, he really was, trying to, blaze a path of a sort. Springsteen in this particular context is more like a faithful son than a musical entrepreneur, and he tries to, I think, in that spirit, curate and extend, a wide range of musical traditions.
Okay, thank you very much. And Springsteen's music has evolved throughout these decades. In the 1980s, his lyrics were not linked to his own experiences, but others. At least this is the way I perceive it. The singer moves from an individualistic perspective, as reflected in Thunder Road or Born to Run, to more mature and thought-provoking stories such as The River, in which he narrates the economic struggles of his sister and brother-in-law. So why do you think this change is due to? Do you think this social compromise finally took place once he redeemed himself from the shadow of his father, Douglas Springsteen? Because in a 2016 interview, he confessed that looking back to Born to Run, one of his greatest and most acclaimed hits, he had realized that his parents lived out quite a bit of that story themselves. So the shadow of his father as a war veteran, his mental illness and frustration caused a huge impact on his composition. So I would like to know, from your points of view, what is the most after this question, what is the most political song that he has composed up to this point as well?
Well, I'll say two things at the outset in trying to answer that question. The first is that Springsteen is, to use a Marxist paradigm here, was an organic intellectual, in the sense that he, unlike everybody else in this session, he was an autodidact. He was poorly educated, didn't go to college. Most of what he learned about American history and culture was through Hollywood and listening to music. And as he got older, he did begin to demonstrate some curiosity, and he had a manager, John Landau, who was college educated and did sort of point out things to him to read. And in the process of doing that, he started to make some connections and begin to see how the life he was living was really part and parcel of sort of larger narratives. And I think that's something that is reflected in his work. And I think that he always hesitated to call himself political, partly because he was, he regarded himself as relatively ignorant, and partly because he didn't want to alienate his audiences, and partly because I think he wanted to think of his artistic vision as not tethered to any kind of ideological source. But as he has gotten older and I think more confident in his identity, he's been more willing to articulate, his basically left of center, sort of moderately left of center, and this certainly in a wider Western, paradigm, worldview. That began about 20 years ago when he, began to perform songs for U.S. presidential candidate John Kerry.
Yeah.
But you ask like what his most political songs are. I mean, this is actually something that's relatively difficult to answer. I mean, some of his. I think one of Springsteen's weakest songs is called "Last to Die," which was a invocation of a John Kerry speech against the Vietnam War. A song like "Born in the USA" clearly has very strong political overtones, but they don't necessarily translate to a direct, statement against the Vietnam War. Weirdly enough, the song is I think a patriotic anthem of a sort, even as it indicates, correctly that lives were manipulated and destroyed by that war. The other thing I'll say, and maybe this is, go back to that sort of Taylor Swift question, is that I think Springsteen was, and he's been very clear about this. He conceived his life's work as a life's work, and that he wanted to, in effect, chronicle what it was like to be a young man, and what it was like, to be his father's son, and to some degree his mother's son, and to get married, and to have children, and to be middle-aged, and to be old. All these things have sort of woven into the fabric of his work. And I think that to a certain extent, I don't get too sidetracked, but I think Taylor Swift has sort of conceived her life in much the same way. So that's sort of part of the source of the parallel there. So I think that, that Springsteen's vision of the people around him, especially his parents, who were, New Deal Democrats. He has said he grew up in such a household. That's how he gradually sort of rounded out his story. I'm not entirely sure I've answered the question, but I'll give you a chance to correct me or steer me if I've gone wrong here.
No. Sorry?
I don't know whether to what degree I've answered your question or veered a little too far off course.
So you wouldn't venture yourself to choose which is the most political song. It's very complicated to choose one.
Yeah, I guess I would say that. I mean, there's nothing that sort of. I mean, there's like an obscure song he wrote called "Seeds" about a displaced oil worker, and there's that line, long limousine, shiny and black. You don't look ahead and you don't look back. There's this, jack of all trades, which is, there's a menace of violence in that song. The Wrecking Ball album generally, I think, is a
masterpiece.
Is a real critique of libertarian economics. So I think you can make that case, and I think you could do so with his blessing. But I don't really fundamentally think of him as a political artist, the way that there are other people we could like say Woody Guthrie, for example, on the one hand, or Billy Bragg, on the other.
Yeah. Okay. Many journalists and scholars attribute the charisma and success of Springsteen to his ability to parallel meanings with each other's lives, as we have already referenced. But how did that 7-year-old boy from New Jersey who tried to recreate Elvis and was hooked on the Beatles as well, to be inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame at the same time that Paul McCartney in 1999? So I would like to know, for you, what's Springsteen's secret ingredient?
I think Springsteen's secret ingredient is sort of twofold. I mean, one is that his genuine love for Well, I think his love for, I could say his love of his country, and I think that that's true. Although I think it's, you can sort of generalize more widely than that. But I think his belief in American mythology, and American mythology, as I think, in some ways you folks are in a better position than me to attest, is, at least in its simplest formulations, a wonderfully attractive notion. I mean, I think that, this idea that your life can be different than it is right now, that you can imagine a destiny for yourself, is something that idea, was not invented in America, but America became a place, and I do want to emphasize that it became a place where such an idea was sort of rooted, and that is so attractive to so many people for such a long period of time, American and non-American alike. And I think that Springsteen's ability to sort of compellingly, again, to use that verb, embody this idea is a big part of his appeal. The other side of that coin is that he was able to do this with a degree of complexity, and an understanding that, there's darker sides to this, in terms of people who don't achieve the dream, and darker sides in this in terms of people who do achieve the dream and find that it's not as easy or as attractive as perhaps you thought it was. That there are people who are included and people who are excluded, and so this sense of complexity is part of it. But the ability to sort of depict that complexity, and to do so with genuine understanding and empathy, is what rounds out that picture and gives us a vision of life, I think, that is enormously attractive and clearly has been quite durable for a half century now. And I will note that Springsteen has said, and I think it's true, that at least at this date late, his audience, as measured in sort of ticket sales for concerts, is probably as much, or if not more, European than it is American. I think he represents Europeans' idea of what a good American looks like in a world when it's kind of getting harder and harder to picture such a thing. So, I mean, I think these are some of the reasons why he has been so compelling.
I can say that last thing is true, because it was very difficult to get tickets for the last Barcelona concert for him. But yeah, I totally agree with you that his empathy when songwriting is one of his key ingredients for success. So thank you very much for participating in this In Conversation series. It has been an absolute pleasure, and now let's start with the questions and answers turn.
To fill the question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm not sure if you can hear me very well.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. First, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful essay. I think that for us students of American literature and American culture, it is very important to examine very closely the American dream. I would like to ask you a very particular question, and it is that the American dream is constantly, I think, revised with the new generations, and it has a very strong intergenerational component. I believe that there is always like an emblem in each generation for what the American dream could mean. But now, with the rise of social media, do you think that it is possible to analyze influencers or social media famous icons as people who can reshape the new American dream with new aspirations or a new effortless wealth and success?
Well, I think you're asking an important question, which is that, the American dream gets, as you say, sort of reconfigured with every generation, and the communications media have always been a key part of that. In the world, I mean, going back to the 18th century, the rise of print culture, which was possible in America because of very high levels of literacy, made it possible not only for sort of political figures like Thomas Jefferson to gain national, even international followings, but also made it possible for, novelists like Harriet Beecher Stowe or Washington Irving, who became very commercially successful. I mean, these were people who wrote best-selling books and made a lot of money, as writers, which sounds almost impossible to believe, right? But and then, each new generation has sort of thrown up figures that embody these media, whether we're talking about, radio and the role of someone like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was able to sort of, that was the sort of social media of his day, Hollywood. And of course, we have a figure like Ronald Reagan, who was a successful Hollywood actor before he became president. And so I think that, it is certainly, I consider it almost inevitable that social media, that influencers will throw up people who become, major figures in our culture and define what the American dream looks like. I'm not a great source because I'm just too old to really be in touch with, what's happening on the ground. I mean, I will note that, like him or hate him, Donald Trump, clearly understood the power of social media and has used it to attain, what he's been able to achieve. I don't really think of him as quite the emblematic figure in this regard, because I think his grasp of the medium is relatively narrow, both in terms of his understanding and his uses of it. But I would fully expect that this is going to happen. I will tell you, I don't know whether, I don't know whether you folks are on TikTok much. I am not, but I've become fascinated by this mysterious musical act called Girly Girl Productions. Maybe 10 Drunk Cigarettes, which is become this viral sort of hit. And a lot of this music is generated by AI. It's been very influential. It's become a background on a lot of sort of personal reels. This is the kind of thing that, this music sounds to me, on the one hand, it sounds to me very, very, very familiar, because AI is often a reconfigure of existing sort of, it's a bricolage of previous stuff. On the other hand, it's being made and being used in entirely new ways. And I just think, as a matter of course, that this will, manifest itself culturally. The interesting question for me is, how legacy figures like Springsteen will, persist or be reimagined, for subsequent generations or not. He's had an incredibly long shelf life. I don't know. I'm looking at all your faces. You're fairly young people. You're fans, I guess, for a little while longer. I don't know, whether your children will know who Bruce Springsteen is or care. But that's the Beatles seem to have some currency. We'll see who else makes it for a little while longer.
Thank you for that answer. And a very interesting point that you made is how once newer generations may or may not forget these figures such as Springsteen or Elvis, do you think that there is something about them that will inevitably persist, or do you think that new figures will come and maybe these people will be forgotten? Or do you think there is something so unique and that is so ingrained in the American culture?
The short answer to your question is no. I think that these figures have a half-life, and I use that radiation metaphor advisedly. They never disappear, but they gradually get smaller over time. There was a time when Louis Armstrong, the great jazz musician, straddled the world like a colossus, as well he should have. Talk about a genius, a Promethean figure who just did something startlingly, shockingly new. And you listen to his 1926 recording, Hotter Than That, and it's just amazing, but how many people really, they might know the name Louis Armstrong, but do they really know his music or understand what made him so just thrilling? I don't think so. This is our job as historians, is to try to, keep that fire alive a little while longer and make possible the rediscovery. And this is what I hope excites you about what you're doing is that these encounters with these people who suddenly burst to life in a way that you might have otherwise overlooked if you just weren't watching and listening and paying attention, and suddenly there they are. And if you can convey that enthusiasm to your charges, then you are doing God's work and keeping their memory alive and giving a great gift at the same time.
Thank you. That was very beautiful. My professors always note that we as students of literature, that is something so, we have the power to make figures eternal. I think it's very beautiful to say it like that. Thank you for your answer.
I'm sorry, I don't see any other questions, but I fear that's because I'm clueless here.
I think Maria, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you so much for being here today, and it was a truly amazing interview. I had one question. As you explained, when Springsteen debuted American Skin at a show in Atlanta only a few decades ago, the audience kind of disagreed, or they showed discontent. And I think that as a
I think I lost Maria there. But I do, she was asking about American Skin and the audience dissatisfaction with what they were hearing.
I think we all lost her, but if you...
Okay. Well, I think I can pick up that thread. I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think it's actually a very good example of what I failed to, Lucia's earlier question that I failed to answer. I mean, that's an example of a really political song, right? And I think it also speaks to one of the most important things an artist can do. I mean, you know, most of the time, especially in the world of popular culture, your success is a matter of confirming what your audience wants to hear. That's what makes somebody popular. You know, mirroring their experience, and I think there's something very wonderful about that and honorable about that. But the truly great artists do not only confirm, they also challenge. And challenging is a very difficult thing to do, as I think, you know, Maria was sort of indicating there, that you run a risk when you do that, because you may alienate, or even worse, lose you know, the attention of your audience. And so I think there is a certain amount of integrity that goes with being willing to do that. And a certain amount of achievement on the parts of artists who really can do that. And I think that Springsteen is one of those people. And you know, and I think it speaks also to, I mean, in that song in particular, you know, his ability to, you know, expand his world. You know, we early in this conversation we talked about, you know, Springsteen's, you know, his sense of history and, you know, understanding his parents. But one of the things I think that's really remarkable about him, and what's remarkable about great artists, is that they never lose the capacity to understand ever wider concentric circles of experience. And, you know, I think that his ability to think sympathetically and yet modestly about, you know, a different racial heritage is important. And by the way, and I'm mindful again with just what I'm seeing here, you know, one of the things I find most interesting about Springsteen is his growing gender capacity, his ability to think and portray women compellingly. I mean, speaking as a man, of course, I'm perhaps somewhat clueless about this, but he just seems to have gotten better and better at that over time. And I think if you're asking me, like, one of my if not my favorite Bruce Springsteen song, I mean, Springsteen is known for his conflicts with his father and a bunch of father songs that he wrote, but the song that he wrote for his mother, called "The Wish," is, I think, one of the most beautiful songs in his canon. And the way that he brings this mother of his to life and makes so vividly clear how much he is his mother's son is you know, just marvelous, and marvelous that this man did this at midlife. You know, that something that probably would not have been possible for him as a young man became, you know, attainable, you know, at a different later point in his life.
Thank you so much for your answer. And I think that he definitely took a risk there, writing such a political song. And I really wanted to ask you if you think the response would have been the same if the song had been released nowadays in the present?
I think it'd be a lot harder now. He probably wouldn't have risked it 20 years earlier, and it would have been far more damaging 20 years later. So that is an interesting sort of thing to think about. Our sense of possibility of expression is not just a matter of our personal development; it's also a matter of the alchemy of a given moment.
Absolutely. I think that at the end of the day, music is a product of our time. So thank you so much for your answer.
I think Gonzalo also wanted to ask a question.
Yes, Gonzalo?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. So I'm picking up with what has been said before, because we were talking about American Skin. And I wanted to ask you about, how do you think it embodies the complexities of racial justice and inequality in America? And how do you think it reflects a more socially conscious version of the American dream as described earlier? Because as you said, Bruce shines in the way of how he can act sympathetically on the other characters. And how do you think he uses that as a vehicle to reflect on the American dream?
Oh, I don't think there's any question that he does, and that he has, what you term social justice is certainly a part of his vision. And you see that critique in any number of songs that he's written over the years, and his embrace of people like Woody Guthrie, and his recording of folk songs, as in Live in Dublin and We Shall Overcome. I also think it's interesting that, going back, to reconnect to an earlier point, that Springsteen, thinks of these things in new and different ways. I'm struck, for example, about how, when he writes about immigration, in a song like The Line, from The Ghost of Tom Joad, he imagines the American dream across the border, across the Rio Grande, in Mexico, not in the United States, and looks at this from a Chicana or a Mexican point of view. In the closing song of Wrecking Ball, it's "We Are Alive," and it's sung from the perspective of a migrant who died trying to get across the border. And of course that's tragic, but it's also in a Christian way. And I think this is actually a very important part of Springsteen's vision, his Catholicism, which we haven't talked about and may or may not get around to. But I bring it up here because there's this spiritual sense of a dream, of an American dream that may yet be resurrected, that is carried in the soul. I mean that in multiple senses of the term, right? Carried in the soul of a migrant, who strived to attain a dream that is undead even after he has died. So, I do think that is very important to him, and something that has, reappeared again and again in his work.
Okay, we have some questions in the chat. So Javier says, well, first of all, thanks a lot for this session. I was wondering, how does Springsteen reimagined American Dream, which includes marginalized voices and multiculturalism, challenge the fears of the American nightmare that Joel Best identifies as middle American society over losing its way of life?
Yeah, I mean, just to continue on my earlier point, I think that he really does try to do that, and I'm thinking of a song, Outlaw Pete, from his Working on a Dream album, in which you have a very conventional Western, kind of lawman tracking down a bad guy, but the story at the end of the day, belongs to his Navajo daughter, who literally has the last word in the story, and so, this is something that he, again, has done over and over again. I will, however, complicate this narrative that I'm giving you of the ever widening concentric circles of Bruce Springsteen's vision, to suggest that even as he imaginatively, stretches himself in what you might call literary terms, he remains deeply, deeply conservative in his musical terms. This is not, Bruce Springsteen is not the Talking Heads. Bruce Springsteen is not, Beyonce. I mean, he has there is a musical matrix that gels for him circa 1970, and he's pretty much been with it ever since. And on those rare occasions like Worlds Apart, where he does try to stray outside his paradigm, the results can be a little bit awkward, just speaking in musicological terms. So lest you think that I'm an uncritical celebrant of all things Springsteen and that he's wonderful in every way, I don't in fact think that's the case.
Thank you very much. And Pedro has also another question. He says, in her classical essay, Why Are Americans Afraid of Dragons, Ursula K. Le Guin observes that Americans have learned to repress their imagination, to reject it as something childish or effeminate, unprofitable, and probably sinful. How does Springsteen's ability to broaden the scope of the American dream by focusing on justice and inclusion reflect the potential for a utopian reimagining of America, in contrast to Ursula, critique that Americans repress their imagination?
Well, Ursula Le Guin, of course, is a great writer, and of course a great writer of alternative worlds. And so I can understand her impatience with what she sees, I think, not inaccurately as an American difficulty with imagining certain kinds of things. The answer I would give to that, which may be a little bit glib, but actually I think has at least some truth to it, is that historically Americans have been so mesmerized by the seemingly tangible, realizable possibilities of this world that they've been less inclined to stretch their imaginations to sort of imagine another world, and I think that this is part of, and actually again to invoke the religious part of it, I mean, I think that this reflects the Protestant work ethic, kind of materialistic dimensions of American culture generally that have been a part of the picture from the very beginning. This is perhaps the more Teutonic side of the American character, as opposed to, say, what we'll call maybe the more Latin side. I'm out here, I'm making a distinction between I'm thinking of Italian Catholicism versus Irish Catholicism. I'm not sure where to put Spanish Catholicism, but I'll leave that to better minds than mine on this.
I think there are a couple of people raising their hands. So.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with Google Meet as a.
I can go first if you don't mind. Yeah,
sorry?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm Carmen. Nice to meet you.
Hello, Carmen.
Congratulations on your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was not familiar with your chapter, so it was really good. So my question is really simple. Do you think that the traditional concept of the American dream can change to be more inclusive within a capitalist system?
Well, I don't think there's any question that it can, and I think that in fact that it has. When you look at, I mean, whether we're let's just talk about American politics. American politics was for a long time a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant domain. It was limited to such people. Different generationally, it gets reiteratively widened. First with the Irish, then the Italians. Then Latinos, African Americans, of course, occupy crucial positions in city governance, and of course, eventually the presidency. We have a person of color running for president of the United States right now. So I think that there's no question that this happens, and I also think that as it happens, distinctive accents, and I use that term literally and figuratively, work their way into the picture. Having said that, what I find remarkable about American culture is just how durable those original matrices that were laid down in the 17th century remain. Culturally speaking, the United States remains a Protestant society, and what people think of as making it from generation to generation, is surprisingly durable within the variations that I'm sort of talking about. And I don't really, I'm just sort of sometimes just bemused by that degree of continuity and that degree of persistence. But I suppose that this is true of a great many civilizations. They solidify at a certain point, and they maintain a character over very long periods of time.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
I can go ahead, perhaps.
Okay, sure.
Hello. Well, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Also speaks very close to my own work, so this was really interesting to hear. I was wondering, because we've been sort of tangentially speaking, sort of circling around the presidential campaign thing. So we've talked about Trump a bit. You've just mentioned Kamala Harris running for president. I think it's like in our collective mind how Barack Obama's sort of run for president was very much like had this great purchase still on the American dream, the rags to riches, the blah, blah, if you can dream it, you can make it rhetoric. Do you reckon this still, like this imaginary, this idea still has purchase on Kamala Harris' campaign?
Oh, for sure it does. And I see that there's a question from Angeles Soriano here about the legacy of the 60s, which I think is actually a very important part of this that we haven't in fact discussed, which is that, Springsteen is a child when Elvis Presley comes along, but he's an adolescent when the 60s happens. He's an adolescent when, during Woodstock, and he's an adolescent during the Vietnam War. And of course, this was a period that really challenged and in the long run leavened our understanding of the American dream. And I think that legacy is very important to Springsteen and very important to someone like Barack Obama and very important to someone like Kamala Harris, who didn't necessarily experience it firsthand, but was a child of it, as the child of an immigrant, as the child of a Jamaican Marxist economist. I mean, this is something that's sort of woven into the fabric of American identity. And I think that tensile, that elastic quality, that ability to incorporate other dimensions or other strains is actually crucial for not just the success of American culture, but any vibrant culture. I mean, immigration is certainly not something that's limited to the United States. Diversity is certainly not something that only happens on this continent. And when you look at the crucible of, say, Spanish history and whether you're talking about, a Muslim heritage or whether you're talking about a Catalan heritage or whatever, these all become somehow Spanish as well as, their sort of individual components.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think we do have another question on the chat. I think you were already mentioning it.
Yes.
So I assume you already read it, or shall we?
Well, I see question about Joel Best here. Which I think we talked about how Springsteen is.
Yeah. There is another one by Angeles that again thanks you for the session, and then the question I think is, we've talked about the influence of Presley, but to what extent did the values of the counterculture of the late 60s? Yeah, I think you were already.
I tried to weave that into my response to Maria. Yeah.
Yeah, the Vietnam War. Right. Okay. Yeah. And again, I think Gonzalo raised his hand.
Okay. I don't see the question. Maybe he can ask me himself.
Yeah. Gonzalo, are you there?
Right. So yes, thank you. I was kind of wanted to see your ideas on, because I see Bruce as a direct kind of descendant musically of Dylan, Guthrie, who you mentioned, of course, and Johnny Cash, figures who were kind of the champion of the weak, the misunderstood, and often even forgotten. And I also wanted to ask you, who do you see as kind of the heir apparent for that figure of the troubadour of this generation? I was thinking Taylor Swift, but I don't think that's the right answer. So I wanted to see your idea on that.
No, I don't think that Taylor Swift represents that particular vein in American cultural history. I'm not sure who does. There are certainly protest music coming out of the United States, as indeed there are other places. But I guess I'll turn the question back to you or anyone who wants to venture a guess. But I don't think anyone has. Part of the problem, I think, in the current state of the United States is that our media landscape is so fractured, both in terms of the way the media have sort of decentralized in the world of social media, but also fractured in terms of sort of ideology, that it's very difficult to create the kind of center that was possible at different points in American history. There's not, I don't think there's a space for a Bob Dylan in 2024 the way that there was in 1964, and so that's part of my difficulty in giving you a good answer to that. Besides my own generational sort of ignorance, I do try to keep up with things a little bit to the extent that I can. But this is an area where I do feel a little bit at a loss in terms of being able to offer anything useful in that regard. And I can't tell whether that's, I'm sure that that's to some degree a function of my own deficiencies, but I don't know to what degree that's also a reflection of the state of the culture as well.
Right. I don't know if there are any, I don't know if anyone wants to answer that. The question that Dr. Cullen asked us, I don't have an answer. And I guess Beyonce's fan, so I'm glad you mentioned her at some point.
Who? I'm sorry.
Beyonce, Queen Bee.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think to some degree that she fills that role. Although I think she's actually, interestingly enough, still pretty invested in sort of conventional success as a kind of media superstar. I mean, she does not strike me as really a genuinely transgressive figure in the way, for example, that say Childish Gambino was. A song like "This Is America," right? Which is a very powerful challenge to the American dream, but partly because he's a multi-talented guy who's got a lot of things going on. I don't think he has chosen to sort of sustain that, that challenge. I mean, he hasn't built a career quite that way. Alternatively, you look at a song like Oliver Anthony's "Rich Men of Richmond," which created a sensation, a year or two ago. But that's a right populism, not a left populism, and that's one of the things that has characterized the United States in recent years, is that there's been a much more unapologetic assertion of right-wing idea, and I think this is true in Europe as well. That's been happening, and so this is a complication that we haven't really experienced in the last couple of generations, and I'm not sure where that's all going to go.
Right. Yeah. I feel like Renaissance, I don't know if you're familiar, but Renaissance, one of Beyonce's last album was getting more into what's America and so on. I mean, she mentions a couple of times, I'm an American, and the implication that these have, but yeah.
Also, if I can give a very short input, I think our generation has distanced itself a little from pop and rock, and maybe we have to look at rap for these new protests, unveiling the American dream kind of music. So maybe figures like Eminem, I think, do that very well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think that one of the challenges for hip hop artists in particular reflects the sort of the state of the music business. I mean, even someone like Eminem, could build a career based on albums that made a lot of money that people sort of went out and bought on an individual basis. Whereas we're living in kind of a more viral musical culture where it's very difficult to put together, I mean, Bruce Springsteen is a very lucky man in that he could make a living as a musician for a while. And indeed, could, released albums that were conceived as a whole year after year. I mean, in that regard, he's a lot closer to Frank Sinatra, who did something similar to that, than say Jay-Z, who is still doing something like that. But my impression is, and again, I invite you to correct me or amplify what I'm saying here, is that it's not easy to make a career quite the way that Springsteen did for younger generations of artists, and to sort of build units of work over a period of time that form a relationship in quite that way. I think Beyonce is one of the few people who you can point to as having done that. But as far as I understand it, Beyonce's characteristic concerns, and this is not a judgment, just an observation, is are far more about things like gender, aging, family life than say war, politics, economy. Even someone like Dylan, who we think of as being that kind of person, actually was only like that part of the time.
Oh, it's a very interesting point, the one that Leila has made, because I was thinking about like Tupac, like Rabbit was a good alternative, and I also believe that like the music industry has completely changed nowadays. It's like many artists don't release CDs, records, but singles. So it's very complicated to make a career nowadays. I believe like only a few, like Taylor Swift, Beyonce, as we have mentioned, Bruno Mars, maybe Lady Gaga, probably. But we have one more
question. You're dating yourselves with these references, I have to say. We're talking about people who, you're getting old, folks. I think that's what I'm hearing.
Carla has another question. She says, thank you very much for this conversation. I'm not an expert on this topic, so I apologize if this is a commonsensical question. I wanted to ask you to what extent the articulation of the American dream, and maybe it's opposite the American nightmare, is dependent on the consumability of the music or the artist. I was wondering about those artists who are on the margins, or who maybe resorts to music styles or genres that are not mainstream. Thank you.
Well, I do think that question does speak to a key dynamic in American culture, which is this. I think it's true in a lot of cultures, but especially in American culture, about this dialectical relationship between the margins and the center. And it's been long been the case. And again, to go full circle to someone like Elvis Presley, that the vitality of American culture has typically come from the margins. And as that vitality gets recognized, it gets absorbed into the center. And then, the process sort of repeats itself. And I think that has been an engine for American society for quite a long time. I mean, at least 100 years in terms of the birth of jazz. And actually going back even further, I would say, to minstrel shows and folk music and whatnot. Although this also, and again, I'm getting out of my element here, and I sort of submit this to your authority. Hip hop as a genre has been around for a long time now. I mean, jazz. I mean, rock and roll knocked off jazz, after about 30 years, and hip hop, sort of displaced rock and roll after about 30 years. And I find myself wondering. I mean, I think hip hop is kind of an old musical idiom, and we seem to be caught in a kind of postmodern cycle here, where we are constantly sort of recycling. And I think the very fact that we're having this conversation is kind of remarkable to me, because Bruce Springsteen's been around for 50 years, and the fact that he's still sort of has the degree of currency he does may say less about Springsteen's genius as an artist. So I think we all can agree that he has some. Than it does the weird moment that we're living in, where we're kind of in this pregnant pause before whatever it is that comes next.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we don't have more questions, and we have already consumed much of your time. So honestly, it has been an absolute pleasure to interview you. Thank you very much, Dr. Cullen.
I greatly appreciate the opportunity. My best to all of you, and thank you for your good work and your goodwill to this crazy country of mine. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you so much.